August 7th, 1942, 20,000 feet above Guadalcanal. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai's hand trembled slightly as he gripped the control stick of his Mitsubishi Zero, recording in his mind images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The water seemed covered with vessels. I had never seen so large a convoy before, although I had flown on many occasions over Japanese troopship fleets during our invasion operations. Through the crystalline Pacific morning air, he witnessed something that contradicted everything his commanders had told him about American weakness. The convoy stretched from horizon to horizon, an armada of steel that defied comprehension. Dozens of warships, transports, cruisers, and destroyers formed a protective screen around the landing beaches. The sheer density of vessels made the ocean itself seem to disappear beneath grey hulls. In Japan, military propaganda had described America as a soft nation, weakened by luxury, divided by democracy, incapable of sustained industrial war. Yet here, 6,000 miles from San Francisco, lay an invasion fleet larger than anything Sakai had seen in 6 years of combat flying. The mathematics of Japanese defeat were being written not in tactical maneuvers, but in production capacity that would soon overwhelm every assumption these pilots carried about their enemy's capabilities. 54 Zeros and 27 bombers from the Tainan Air Group had departed Rabaul at dawn that morning. Their mission was to strike the American landing forces at Guadalcanal and Tulagi. But what Sakai saw below him was not a vulnerable landing operation that could be disrupted. It was industrial might made manifest, a demonstration of production capacity so overwhelming that it rendered Japanese numerical calculations meaningless. The transformation of understanding had begun 3 months earlier, on June 4, 1942, in the waters off Midway Atoll. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the second wave attack on Midway Island, had radioed back a message that changed everything. There is need for a second attack wave. His observation, based on the American air defenses remaining active, set in motion Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm his reserve aircraft. But what Japanese commanders did not yet understand was that American industrial capacity meant losses could be replaced faster than they could inflict them. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, vessels that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. More critically, it cost the Imperial Japanese Navy over 300 experienced pilots, men whose training had taken years to complete. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, retired to his cabin after the battle and refused to see anyone for 3 days. When a subordinate wondered who would apologize to the emperor for the defeat, Yamamoto answered simply, "Leave that to me. I am the only one who must apologize to His Majesty." But the true scope of the disaster was not yet apparent. Japanese leadership believed they could rebuild their carrier forces, train new pilots, and prepare for the decisive battle that would still deliver victory. What they failed to comprehend was the industrial equation that would make such recovery impossible. While Japan struggled to replace 4 carriers and 300 pilots, America was already building vessels and training aviators at a rate that would prove insurmountable. Saburo Sakai had been born in 1916 in Saga Prefecture into a family that traced its samurai ancestry back centuries. His path to the cockpit of a Zero fighter had been shaped by poverty and determination. After his father's death when Sakai was 11, he had enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Navy at age 16, enduring the brutal training regimen that transformed recruits into naval ratings. The beatings were severe. Stand tall to the wall. Bend down, recruit Sakai. I am not doing this because I hate you, but because I like you and want you to make a good seaman. In 1937, Sakai had been accepted into pilot training, graduating first in his class at Tsuchiura. Emperor Hirohito himself had presented him with a silver watch, an honor that marked him as elite among the elite. By 1938, he was flying combat missions over China in the Mitsubishi A-5M fighter, experiencing his first taste of aerial warfare. In 1940, he transitioned to the revolutionary new A-6M-0, an aircraft that would define Japanese air superiority in the war's opening months. The Zero was a masterpiece of engineering focused on a single principle, range and maneuverability at any cost. With an operational radius of over 500 nautical miles, it could escort bombers on missions that American intelligence analysts deemed impossible. Its legendary turning ability came from an airframe so light that American pilots initially could not believe such performance was achievable. Japanese designers had accomplished this by eliminating every possible gram of excess weight, including armor plating for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. This design philosophy reflected a deeper strategic assumption. Japanese doctrine emphasized the offensive, the first strike, the aggressive pursuit of the enemy. Armor was for the defensive-minded. Self-sealing fuel tanks were for those who expected to be hit. The Zero pilot was trained to destroy the enemy before the enemy could shoot back. For the first 6 months of the war, this philosophy seemed vindicated by an unbroken string of victories. On December 8, 1941, Sakai flew one of 45 Zeros from the Tainan Air Group that attacked Clark Air Base in the Philippines. He shot down a Curtiss P-40 Warhawk in his first combat against Americans and destroyed 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses by strafing them on the ground. Over the following months, he flew missions over the Dutch East Indies, demonstrating the combat superiority that made the Zero feared throughout the Pacific. By the time of Guadalcanal, Sakai had accumulated over 3,000 hours of flight time and numerous aerial victories. The American landing at Guadalcanal on August 7th represented a fundamental shift in the Pacific War. For the first time, the United States was taking the offensive, seizing territory that Japan had captured in the war's opening months. The target was Henderson Field, an airstrip under construction that would give American forces a base from which to threaten Japanese positions throughout the Solomon Islands. Control of Guadalcanal meant control of the sea lanes to Australia. Loss of Guadalcanal meant the beginning of the end of Japan's defensive perimeter. As Sakai's formation approached Guadalcanal that morning, he pressed his face against the canopy, counting ships below. He stopped counting at 30, then 40, then 50. The vessels kept appearing, stretching to the limits of visibility. Transport ships unloading men and equipment, destroyers patrolling in protective screens, cruisers with their guns trained skyward. And somewhere among them, though not visible to Sakai at that moment, were the aircraft carriers that had launched the fighters, now rising to meet the Japanese attack. The combat that followed would become one of the most famous aerial engagements of the Pacific War. American F-4F Wildcats from the carriers Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp rose to intercept the Japanese formation. The Wildcats were inferior to the Zero in speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, but they possessed something the Zero lacked: armor, bulletproof windscreens, steel plating behind the pilot's seat, and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb punishment without exploding into flames. Sakai engaged multiple Wildcats during the battle, confident in his superior aircraft and extensive training. He positioned his Zero behind one American fighter and opened fire with his 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. To his shock, the Wildcat absorbed the punishment and kept flying. The bullets seemed to have no effect. The American pilot maneuvered aggressively, refusing to go down despite taking hits that would have destroyed a Zero instantly. What Sakai was experiencing, though he did not yet have words for it, was the first manifestation of American industrial philosophy made flesh. The Wildcat was not designed to win dogfights through superior maneuverability. It was designed to absorb damage, protect its pilot, and rely on coordinated team tactics rather than individual skill. It was built with the assumption that the pilot was more valuable than the aircraft, because America could build replacement aircraft faster than it could train replacement pilots with thousands of hours of experience. During the engagement, Sakai made a critical error. He misidentified a formation of Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers as fighters and attacked from behind. The rear gunners opened fire, and a bullet struck Sakai in the head, destroying his right eye and paralyzing the left side of his body. Blood filled his cockpit, his vision blurred. By every reasonable expectation, he should have died within minutes. What happened next became one of aviation history's most remarkable survival stories. Despite catastrophic head wounds, partial blindness, and intermittent consciousness, Sakai flew his damaged Zero over 560 miles back to Rabaul. The 4-hour and 47-minute flight required him to repeatedly strike his own wounds to shock himself back to consciousness when he began to black out. The Zero's extreme range, the same characteristic that had made it so effective offensively, now saved his life by giving him just enough fuel to reach safety. Sakai's debriefing before he collapsed revealed crucial information about the American forces at Guadalcanal, but more importantly his observations about the size of the convoy and the unexpected resilience of American aircraft began filtering through Japanese command structures. The reports were initially dismissed as exaggerations born of combat stress and injury. No nation could project such force so far from its home bases. The Americans must have stripped their defenses elsewhere to gather such a fleet. It was unsustainable. But the reports kept coming from other pilots, other battles, other encounters with American forces. The Americans always had more ships, more planes, more pilots, and critically they always came back. Japanese pilots would shoot down American aircraft by the dozens, inflicting what seemed like decisive losses, only to find the next day's patrol facing the same numbers as before. The Allies seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft, Sakai would later write. A week never went by without the enemy suffering losses, yet his planes came, by 2 and 3s and by the dozens. The industrial reality behind these observations would have seemed impossible to Japanese commanders schooled in resource-limited warfare. While Japan was producing approximately 7,000 aircraft per year in 1942, American factories were already building over 47,000. By 1944, American aircraft production would reach 96,000 planes annually, while Japanese production peaked at 28,000. The United States was not just outproducing Japan, it was outproducing Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. The roots of this industrial disparity stretched back decades before the war began. America's automobile industry had pioneered mass production techniques that Japan had never fully adopted. The Ford Motor Company alone, having perfected the assembly line method before World War I, could apply those techniques to aircraft production with devastating efficiency. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, workers completed a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes at peak production. The facility, which covered 67 acres under one roof, employed 42,000 workers operating 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. But it was not merely the size of American factories that created the production advantage. It was the systematic approach to manufacturing that treated aircraft as products rather than handcrafted artifacts. Boeing's production of the B-17 Flying Fortress increased from 60 aircraft per month in 1942 to 362 per month in 1944. This six-fold increase was achieved through continuous refinement of manufacturing processes, standardization of parts, and coordination between multiple factories producing components that could be assembled anywhere in the system. The Japanese aircraft industry, by contrast, remained rooted in artisanal manufacturing methods. Even at peak war production, Japanese factories relied heavily on skilled craftsmen hand-fitting components. Quality control focused on individual excellence rather than systematic standardization. This approach produced superb individual aircraft, but could never achieve the production volumes that mass manufacturing enabled. When American factories discovered production bottlenecks, they redesigned the manufacturing process. When Japanese factories encountered similar problems, they assigned more skilled workers to overcome them through individual effort. Japanese aircraft production faced multiple structural challenges that limited output regardless of worker dedication or skill. The lack of interchangeable parts meant that components from one factory often could not be used in aircraft assembled at another facility. This required maintaining separate supply chains and prevented the kind of distributed production that American industry employed so effectively. When bombing damaged a Japanese aircraft factory, production could not easily be shifted to undamaged facilities because the components were not standardized. Material shortages increasingly constrained Japanese production as the war progressed. Aluminum, essential for aircraft construction, became scarce as American submarines sank the cargo ships, bringing bauxite from Southeast Asian mines to Japanese refineries. Synthetic substitutes proved inferior in quality and more difficult to work with. High-quality steel for engines and critical components also grew scarce. By late 1944, some Japanese aircraft were being built with wooden components in place of metal ones, saving strategic materials but reducing performance and reliability. The Japanese aircraft industry also suffered from organizational fragmentation that prevented efficient resource allocation. The Imperial Army and Imperial Navy each operated separate aircraft development and production programs, often duplicating efforts and competing for scarce resources. Army and Navy aircraft used different engines, different weapons, even different fuel specifications, preventing economies of scale and complicating logistics. Attempts to rationalize production and create common standards repeatedly failed due to inter-service rivalry and bureaucratic inertia. Labor force issues further limited Japanese production. Unlike American factories, which drew heavily on women workers to replace men who had joined the military, Japanese industry remained reluctant to employ women in significant numbers, even as labor shortages grew acute. Cultural attitudes about appropriate roles for women meant that Japan failed to mobilize a significant portion of its potential workforce. The workers who were available often lacked adequate training, as skilled craftsmen were conscripted into military service and replaced by inexperienced laborers who required close supervision. Quality control. Problems increased as experienced workers left for military service and were replaced by hastily trained substitutes. Aircraft that had been meticulously assembled by skilled craftsmen before the war were increasingly produced by workers who had received only minimal training. Defect rates rose. Aircraft required more maintenance. Combat losses included planes that failed due to manufacturing defects rather than enemy action. The systematic approach to quality that characterized American mass production was absent from Japanese manufacturing, which relied on individual craftsmanship that could not be easily replicated or scaled. The human dimension of this industrial disparity was equally telling. American pilot training programs produced approximately 8,000 new naval aviators per month by 1944. These pilots received extensive training, typically 18 months of flight school, with over 500 hours of flying time before entering combat. The training pipeline stretched from pre-flight school through primary training, intermediate training, and advanced training, each stage building systematically on the previous one. Students learned not just how to fly aircraft, but how to navigate by instruments, how to operate as part of formations, how to communicate effectively with ground controllers and other pilots, and how to employ weapons systems effectively. American training philosophy emphasized building large numbers of competent pilots rather than producing a small elite of exceptional aviators. This approach reflected industrial thinking applied to human capital development. Just as American factories used standardized processes to build large numbers of reliable aircraft rather than handcrafting a few exceptional machines, American training produced large numbers of reliable pilots rather than focusing exclusively on developing a small number of elite performers. The system worked because it matched industrial capacity with human resource development, ensuring that the aircraft rolling off assembly lines had trained crews ready to fly them. Training facilities themselves represented significant industrial investments. The United States established dozens of flight training bases across the country, many in areas with favorable weather that allowed year-round flying. These bases included not just runways and hangars, but complete support infrastructure, maintenance facilities, housing for instructors and students, classrooms equipped with the latest training aids, and even link trainers, primitive flight simulators that allowed students to practice instruments, procedures, without using expensive flight hours or risking aircraft. The fuel allocated to American training programs alone exceeded total Japanese aviation fuel consumption in many months. American student pilots could afford to make mistakes, to practice difficult maneuvers repeatedly, to build experience gradually under supervised conditions. They flew training missions in aircraft that, while often obsolete for combat, were well maintained and adequately supplied with fuel and spare parts. By the time they reached fleet squadrons, American pilots had internalized procedures and developed reflexes through hundreds of hours of practice. By contrast, Japanese pilot training programs, which had produced the world's most skilled aviators before the war, collapsed under the strain of attempting to replace combat losses while simultaneously expanding the Air Force. Lieutenant Commander Tadashi Nakajima, an instructor at the Yokosuka Naval Air Training Command, documented the decline with growing alarm. Before the war, candidates for pilot training competed intensely for limited slots. Out of 1,500 sailors who applied for the pilot trainee system in 1937, only 70 were accepted and 25 graduated. The training lasted over 3 years and emphasized not just flying skills but tactical doctrine, navigation, and combat theory. Graduates emerged as highly competent aviators capable of complex missions. By 1943, the pressure to replace losses forced drastic changes. Training programs were shortened from 3 years to less than 1 year. Flight hours before combat deployment dropped from over 600 hours to under 200, then to under 100 by late 1944. The curriculum eliminated advanced tactical training to focus on basic flight skills. Instructors were pulled from training duties and sent to combat units to fill gaps left by casualties. Everything was urgent, Nakajima later recalled. We trained boys to fly and sent them to die, knowing they were unprepared but having no choice. The quality gap became apparent in combat results. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese naval aviation ceased to exist as an effective force. Over 2 days of fighting, American pilots and anti-aircraft gunners shot down approximately 480 Japanese carrier aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. American pilots dubbed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a description that captured both the one-sided nature of the engagement and the shocking disparity in pilot quality. Japanese commanders observing the battle struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. Admiral Saburo Ozawa had launched 430 aircraft from 9 carriers against 15 American carriers. He expected, based on pre-war doctrine and experience, that Japanese superior pilot skill and aircraft performance would offset American numerical advantages. Instead, his air groups were systematically destroyed by better-trained American pilots flying superior aircraft equipped with new technology that Japanese intelligence had failed to predict. The proximity fuse, a top-secret American invention, proved particularly devastating. These miniature radar units, embedded in anti-aircraft shells, detonated automatically when passing near aircraft. They required no direct hit, dramatically increasing the effectiveness of ship-based anti-aircraft fire. Japanese pilots flew into walls of exploding shrapnel that destroyed aircraft before they could reach attack positions. Entire formations were annihilated before releasing their weapons. The survivors who returned to their carriers brought reports of defensive firepower unlike anything they had encountered before. But technology alone did not account for the lopsided victory. American fighter pilots, many of them combat veterans by this point, employed coordinated tactics that exploited the Zero's weaknesses. They refused to engage in the turning dogfights where the Zero excelled. Instead, they used superior speed and teamwork to execute diving attacks from above, striking quickly and disengaging before Japanese pilots could respond. The thatch weave, a defensive maneuver developed by American pilots in the war's early months, allowed pairs of fighters to protect each other from Japanese attacks while setting up counterattacks. Japanese pilots, often flying their first or second combat missions, attempted the individual aerial combat for which they had been trained but for which they lacked sufficient experience. They broke formation to pursue individual targets, exposing themselves to coordinated attacks by multiple American fighters. They expended ammunition in long, inaccurate bursts rather than the short, precise firing patterns that experienced pilots used. They failed to maintain situational awareness, allowing American pilots to attack from their blind spots. The Battle of the Philippine Sea effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. Of the 430 aircraft Ozawa launched, only 35 returned. 3 fleet carriers were sunk, including the brand-new Taiho, which Admiral Ozawa had used as his flagship. The mobile fleet still possessed carriers after the Plom's battle, but it lacked trained aircrews and replacement aircraft. When these carriers reappeared at the Battle of Leyte Gulf 4 months later, they served purely as decoys, sailing into battle with skeleton air groups solely to draw American forces away from the decisive action elsewhere. Admiral Somu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, offered Ozawa's resignation after the defeat but refused to accept it. "I am more responsible for this defeat than Admiral Ozawa," Toyoda said. The honesty of this admission reflected a growing recognition among senior Japanese commanders that they faced an enemy whose industrial capacity rendered traditional naval warfare obsolete. Japan could not win a battle of attrition against an opponent who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The submarine war in the Pacific provided another brutal demonstration of American industrial superiority. By 1944, the United States Navy operated over 150 submarines in the Pacific, each equipped with effective radar and reliable torpedoes. Japanese merchant shipping, essential for moving resources from conquered territories to the home islands, hemorrhaged under sustained submarine attack. In 1944 alone, American submarines sank 603 Japanese merchant vessels totaling over 2.6 million tons. Japan's response to the submarine threat revealed the limits of an economy already stretched beyond capacity. Convoy systems, which required escort vessels, were implemented far too late and with insufficient resources. Many merchant ships sailed individually or with minimal protection, making them easy targets for American submarines. Anti-submarine warfare, which required specialized equipment, training, and aircraft, competed with other urgent priorities for limited resources. Industrial capacity that might have built escort vessels instead went to constructing battleships and carriers that could not operate, without fuel transported by the very merchant ships being sunk. The mathematics were inexorable. Japan began the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant shipping. To maintain its economy and military operations, it needed to import resources requiring approximately 3 million tons of active shipping capacity. But losses to submarines, aircraft, and mines steadily reduced the available fleet. By 1944, Japanese imports of oil, iron ore, and other critical materials began falling dramatically. Factories reduced production, training programs cut fuel allocations, combat units operated with insufficient supplies. American factory workers, meanwhile, were producing replacement cargo vessels at rates that seemed impossible by Japanese standards. Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels built in shipyards that had barely existed before the war, came off the ways at a rate of 3 per day at peak production. These vessels, built in modular sections and welded together rather than riveted, could be completed in as little as 42 days. The SS Robert E. Peary set a record by launching just 4 days and 15 hours after its keel was laid. One shipyard alone, Kaiser's facility in Richmond, California, employed nearly 100,000 workers and launched 747 vessels during the war. The Liberty ship program represented industrial innovation on a massive scale. Traditional shipbuilding treated each vessel as a custom project, with components fabricated on site and assembled by skilled craftsmen who spent years learning their trade. Liberty ships were designed specifically for mass production, with standardized components that could be manufactured in factories far from shipyards and transported for final assembly. The welding techniques used instead of traditional riveting allowed less skilled workers to perform tasks that previously required years of apprenticeship. Shipyards themselves were transformed from craft workshops into industrial assembly lines. Rather than building ships from bow to stern in sequential operations, Liberty ship construction employed parallel production of major sections that were then lifted by massive cranes and welded together. This allowed work to proceed simultaneously on multiple parts of the vessel, dramatically reducing construction time. Workers specialized in specific tasks rather than learning all aspects of shipbuilding, allowing rapid training of new employees drawn from populations with no previous maritime experience. The scale of American shipbuilding extended far beyond Liberty ships. Essex-class aircraft carriers, massive vessels displacing over 30,000 tons, were built in numbers that exceeded Japan's total capital ship construction during the war. The United States commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers during the war, each capable of operating over 100 aircraft. These were supplemented by dozens of smaller escort carriers built on merchant ship hulls, providing fleet support and aircraft ferry capability that Japan could never match. Battleship construction, though less critical in the carrier-dominated Pacific War, also demonstrated American industrial capacity. The United States commissioned 10 new battleships during the war years, modern vessels equipped with radar-directed fire control systems, advanced damage control capabilities, and anti-aircraft batteries that turned them into floating fortresses against air attack. Japan, meanwhile, completed only 2 new battleships during the same period, the massive Yamato and Musashi, whose enormous guns proved largely irrelevant in a war dominated by carrier aviation. Destroyer production reached truly staggering levels. The United States built over 350 Fletcher-class destroyers, versatile vessels that served as escorts, submarine hunters, and radar pickets. These were supplemented by hundreds of destroyer escorts, smaller, vessels built even more quickly than destroyers and optimized for anti-submarine warfare. By 1945, the U.S. Plays. Navy possessed more destroyers and destroyer escorts than Japan had built warships of all types during the entire war. The scale of American industrial mobilization extended far beyond ships and aircraft. Tank production reached over 88,000 vehicles during the war, compared to Japan's approximately 6,000. Artillery pieces numbered over 250,000 American units versus under 15,000 Japanese. Even in categories where Japan had technical superiority, such as torpedoes, American industrial capacity overwhelmed quality advantages through sheer quantity and continuous improvement. Behind these production numbers lay logistics networks of staggering complexity and efficiency. Every tank, aircraft, and ship required not just initial construction but ongoing supply of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and maintenance support. American industry excelled not merely at building weapons but at sustaining them in combat across vast distances. The logistics infrastructure that supported American forces in the Pacific represented an industrial achievement as significant as the weapons themselves. Consider the fuel requirements alone. A single Essex-class carrier consumed tens of thousands of gallons of fuel oil daily when operating at full capacity. The aircraft it carried required high-octane aviation gasoline, thousands of gallons per day of flight operations. Escort vessels needed additional fuel oil. The entire task force might consume over 1 million gallons of fuel during a week of intensive operations. Multiply this by the numerous task forces operating simultaneously across the Pacific, and the scale of fuel logistics becomes apparent. America met these fuel demands through a petroleum industry that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. American oil wells, primarily in Texas, California, and Oklahoma, produced approximately 60% of the world's petroleum during the war. Refineries processed this crude oil into gasoline, diesel, and fuel oil optimized for specific military applications. Tanker ships, many built specifically for the war, transported millions of barrels across oceans. Forward area facilities stored fuel and distributed it to combat vessels, often while those vessels were underway through at sea, refueling techniques that Japanese forces never mastered. Ammunition supply presented equally daunting logistics challenges. Naval guns consumed shells by the thousands during bombardment operations. Aircraft dropped bombs and fired machine gun ammunition measured in tons. Artillery batteries supporting ground operations might fire tens of thousands of rounds during major engagements. Every round had to be manufactured, stored, shipped halfway around the world, and delivered to the unit that needed it exactly when required. American ammunition production reached levels that Japanese planners would have considered impossible. Small arms ammunition alone totaled over 40 billion rounds during the war. Artillery shells numbered in the hundreds of millions. Bombs for aircraft ranged from small fragmentation munitions to massive blockbusters weighing thousands of pounds each. Naval shells for battleships and cruisers, each weighing hundreds of pounds, were produced by the tens of thousands. The industrial capacity required to manufacture this quantity of munitions, using scarce materials like brass and explosives, exceeded Japan's total manufacturing capability across all product categories. Spare parts logistics represented perhaps the most complex challenge. Every military system, from aircraft to ships to vehicles, contained thousands of components that could fail and require replacement. Maintaining combat readiness required having the right spare part available when needed, even though failures were often unpredictable. American industry addressed this through massive overproduction of spare parts combined with sophisticated distribution systems that moved components to where they were needed. The logistics network supporting operations in the Pacific included dozens of major supply depots, hundreds of forward supply points, and thousands of supply ships constantly moving materials from production centers to combat zones. This network operated with remarkable efficiency, ensuring that units rarely faced critical shortages despite operating thousands of miles from home bases. Japanese forces, by contrast, frequently experienced severe supply shortages, even in areas relatively close to Japan, as their logistics infrastructure collapsed under the strain of submarine attacks and inadequate merchant shipping. The American economy's ability to simultaneously fight a two-ocean war while improving civilian living standards mystified Japanese analysts. In Japan, total war mobilization meant systematic reduction of consumer goods, strict rationing of food and fuel, and conscription of civilian labor for military production. The Japanese people endured genuine hardship as their economy devoted ever larger percentages of output to military purposes. By 1944, over 50% of Japan's gross national product went to direct military expenditure, with most of the remainder allocated to food production. Daily life in wartime Japan reflected this total mobilization. Food rationing reduced average caloric intake to levels that left many civilians chronically hungry. Rice, the staple of Japanese diet, became scarce as agricultural labor was diverted to military production and imports from occupied territories became unreliable. Substitute foods of inferior nutritional value replaced traditional meals. Urban residents cultivated small garden plots to supplement inadequate rations. Malnutrition increased, particularly among children and elderly. Clothing and household goods became increasingly difficult to obtain as textile production shifted to military uniforms and industrial uses. Civilians wore patched and mended garments until they literally fell apart. Shoes were resoled repeatedly and wooden clogs replaced leather footwear. Household items like cooking pots, tools, and furniture could not be replaced when they wore out. Metal items were collected for recycling into military equipment, leaving homes stripped of even basic utensils. Fuel shortages affected every aspect of civilian life. Coal for heating became scarce, leaving many homes cold during winter months. Electricity was rationed, with residential areas experiencing regular blackouts to conserve power for industrial use. Transportation ground to a near halt as fuel allocations went entirely to military purposes. Civilians walked or used bicycles for journeys that had previously required trains or buses. Intercity travel became nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. The contrast with American civilian experience during the same period could not have been more stark. American civilians, by contrast, experienced rising prosperity during the war years. Unemployment, which had plagued the American economy throughout the 1930s Great Depression, effectively disappeared as factories absorbed millions of workers. Wages rose. Families purchased homes. Even with rationing of certain items like gasoline, sugar, and meat, American citizens ate better during the war than most had during the previous decade. The United States devoted approximately 40% of its gross national product to military spending at peak mobilization, a lower percentage than Japan, yet produced far more military equipment because its economy was so much larger. American workers earned wages that allowed them to save money even after purchasing war bonds. Many families accumulated savings during the war years that they used afterward to buy homes, cars, and consumer goods. Women entering the workforce for the first time gained economic independence and purchasing power. Despite rationing, most Americans never experienced actual hunger or serious deprivation. The worst hardship most civilians faced was inability to purchase new automobiles or certain luxury goods, inconveniences that seemed trivial compared to conditions in Japan or Europe. The difference reflected not merely larger American economic capacity but fundamental differences in economic efficiency. American agriculture fed both the military and civilian population while producing surplus food for export to allies. Industrial production met military requirements while maintaining substantial consumer goods output. The American economic system, despite its size advantage, also operated more efficiently than Japan's, producing more output per worker and using resources more effectively. Japanese economic planners, trained in theories emphasizing state direction and centralized control, struggled to understand how American capitalism achieved such efficiency. They expected that wartime mobilization would require choosing between guns and butter, between military production and civilian welfare. America's ability to provide both simultaneously seemed to violate economic logic as they understood it. The explanation lay partly in sheer economic size, but also in market mechanisms that allocated resources more efficiently than central planning could achieve. This economic reality would have seemed like fantasy to Japanese military planners. How could America simultaneously build the world's largest military force and improve civilian living standards? The answer lay in the fundamental size and productivity of the American economy. In 1944, American gross national product exceeded $700 billion in current value, more than 10 times Japan's gross national product of approximately $60 billion. This disparity meant that even a smaller percentage of American economic output produced more absolute military capability than Japan's total mobilization could achieve. The human cost of this industrial disparity manifested in countless individual combat actions throughout the Pacific. Japanese soldiers and sailors repeatedly encountered American forces equipped with overwhelming material advantages. Artillery barrages that seemed to have no end, airstrikes that returned hour after hour, naval bombardments that pulverized defensive positions with thousands of shells. Japanese defenders often fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, inflicting heavy casualties on attacking American forces. But courage and skill could not overcome the simple mathematical reality that American forces could replace losses while Japanese forces could not. On Saipan in June 1944, Japanese defenders faced an invasion force of 70,000 American troops supported by hundreds of ships and over 900 aircraft. The battle lasted 3 weeks and cost the lives of approximately 30,000 Japanese defenders. Nearly all fought to the death rather than surrender. American casualties, while heavy by previous standards, totaled approximately 14,000, with 3,000 killed. But the strategic impact was not measured in casualty ratios. It was measured in what came next. Saipan's capture placed American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. These massive 4-engine bombers, the most advanced aircraft of the war, could carry enormous bomb loads over ranges exceeding 3,000 miles. From bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, B-29s began systematic bombardment of Japanese cities and industries. The aircraft themselves represented an industrial achievement that Japan could not match. Boeing and its partners produced over 3,900 B-29s during the war, each one requiring over 600,000 individual parts assembled by workers in multiple states. The firebombing campaign that followed devastated Japanese cities. On March 9th and 10th, 1945, a single raid by 334 B-29s dropped over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that killed over 100,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Similar raids struck Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of other urban areas. By summer 1945, Japan's urban areas and industrial capacity had been systematically destroyed from the air, an outcome made possible only by American ability to build hundreds of advanced bombers, train their crews, and sustain operations across thousands of miles of ocean. Saburo Sakai, recovering from his wounds at Guadalcanal, watched this transformation with growing comprehension. After months of surgery and rehabilitation in Japan, having lost sight in his right eye, he returned to combat duty as a flight instructor. The young pilots he trained bore little resemblance to the elite aviators he had served alongside in the war's early years. They had minimal flight hours, inadequate training, and aircraft that were increasingly obsolete compared to American fighters. Yet they went to their assignments with determination and courage, knowing they faced overwhelming odds. In late 1944, Sakai was ordered to join a kamikaze special attack unit. The desperation implicit in this order represented the final acknowledgement that conventional tactics could no longer inflict sufficient damage on American forces. If Japanese pilots could not outfight American pilots, if Japanese aircraft could no longer penetrate American defenses through skill and maneuverability, then perhaps suicide attacks could succeed through sheer determination. I had accumulated 3,800 hours of combat flying experience, Sakai later recalled. I couldn't believe my commanders wanted to waste all that in a single mission. The kamikaze campaign, launched in organized form at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, reflected strategic bankruptcy masked as spiritual resolve. Young pilots with minimal training were loaded into aircraft, laden with explosives, and ordered to crash into American ships. The tactic achieved some successes, sinking dozens of vessels and damaging many more, but it could not alter the fundamental strategic situation. For every American ship sunk by kamikaze attacks, American shipyards launched multiple replacements. For every Japanese pilot who died in a kamikaze attack, America trained dozens more aviators to replace its own losses. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks on American forces was significant but not decisive. Sailors dreaded the sight of Japanese aircraft deliberately crashing into their ships, accepting certain death to inflict damage. But American forces developed countermeasures, improved radar systems for early detection, increased anti-aircraft defenses, and refined fighter interception tactics. The kamikaze threat was contained through systematic application of resources and technology that Japan could not match. Admiral William Halsey, commanding American naval forces in the Pacific, observed that kamikaze attacks were effective but not decisive. This assessment captured the essential reality. Japan could still hurt American forces. It could inflict casualties, sink ships, and disrupt operations. But it could no longer prevent American advances or alter the war's outcome. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate arbiter of victory, and that contest had been decided long before the first kamikaze pilot crashed into an American ship. In early 1945, as American forces prepared to invade Okinawa, only 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, the full scope of the industrial disparity became apparent even to die-hard believers in Japanese. Spirit overcoming material weakness. The invasion fleet that assembled for Operation Iceberg included over 1,500 ships, the largest amphibious force ever gathered. 452 destroyers and destroyer escorts formed screens around transport and cargo vessels. 18 escort carriers and 11 fleet carriers provided air support. Battleships and cruisers stood ready to bombard shore defenses. This armada represented industrial capacity so vast that it exceeded Japan's entire naval construction during the war. While Japan struggled to keep a handful of major combatants operational, America was deploying hundreds of vessels on a single operation while maintaining forces in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and across the Pacific. The United States launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan constructed during the entire war. By 1945, American shipyards had built over 5,000 major combatants and tens of thousands of support vessels, landing craft, and small boats. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the full application of this industrial advantage. American forces landed over 180,000 troops, supported by endless streams of supplies, ammunition, and equipment. Japanese defenders, fighting from prepared positions with great skill and determination, inflicted over 50,000 American casualties, including 12,000 dead. But they could not overcome the systematic application of overwhelming firepower. American artillery, naval guns, and aircraft pulverized defensive positions. When Japanese forces counterattacked, they ran into defensive fires that destroyed entire units. Offshore, kamikaze attacks struck American naval forces with unprecedented intensity. Over 1,900 kamikaze sorties damaged or sank dozens of ships. The destroyer USS Laffey survived hits by 6 kamikaze aircraft and 4 bombs in 80 minutes of continuous attack, testament both to Japanese desperation and American damage control capabilities. But even this maximum effort could not drive the American fleet away from Okinawa. For every damaged vessel, replacements arrived. Destroyed aircraft were replaced within hours from escort carriers, serving as floating warehouses of spare planes. Casualties were evacuated to hospital ships and medical facilities that provided care exceeding anything available to Japanese forces. By June 1945, when organized resistance on Okinawa ended, Japan had lost over 100,000 defenders, thousands of aircraft, and its last hopes of preventing invasion of the home islands. American forces controlled air bases from which they could launch attacks anywhere in Japan. The naval blockade had reduced Japanese imports to a trickle. Food shortages affected even military units. Fuel scarcity grounded aircraft and immobilized ships. The industrial base had been largely destroyed by bombing. Yet Emperor Hirohito and the Supreme War Council debated continuing the war, searching for a decisive battle that might force favorable peace terms. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought this fantasy of continued resistance to an abrupt end. But even these weapons, devastating as they were, represented extensions of American industrial capacity rather than magic solutions. The Manhattan Project, which developed atomic weapons, employed over 130,000 people and cost over $2 billion, equivalent to over $30 billion in modern value. This was more than Japan's entire military budget for some years of the war. America could afford to pursue advanced weapons development while simultaneously fighting a global war because its economy was large enough to do both. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese nation by radio for the first time in history. His words, carefully crafted to avoid explicit admission of defeat, acknowledged that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. This masterpiece of understatement concealed the reality that Japan had been systematically defeated by an enemy whose industrial capacity rendered continued resistance suicidal. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, Hirohito noted, referring to atomic weapons. But the truth was that Japan had already been defeated by conventional weapons produced in quantities that Japanese industry could never match. Saburo Sakai's kamikaze mission, scheduled for August 16th, was cancelled when Japan surrendered. He survived to reflect on his experiences and what they revealed about the nature of modern warfare. In later years, he became an advocate for peace and reconciliation between Japan and the United States. He recognized that the defeat had not been primarily about courage, skill, or fighting spirit. It had been about industrial capacity, and in that contest, Japan had never had a realistic chance of victory. After the war, Sakai and other surviving Japanese aviators had the opportunity to examine American aircraft and production facilities. They toured factories that had built thousands of aircraft. They saw assembly lines that produced complex machines with efficiency Japanese industry had never achieved. They learned that American pilot training programs had graduated tens of thousands of aviators during the war, while Japanese programs struggled to produce thousands. The scale of American mobilization, which they had experienced as enemy combatants, became comprehensible as industrial achievement rather than propaganda fantasy. In 1991, Sakai attended a reunion in San Diego with American pilots he had fought against at Guadalcanal. Among them was James Sutherland, the Wildcat pilot whose aircraft had absorbed Sakai's cannon fire without going down. The two men, former enemies who had tried to kill each other nearly 50 years earlier, embraced as friends. They shared stories of that August morning in 1942 when both nearly died in combat. Sakai apologized for shooting down American pilots. Sutherland responded that they had both been doing their duty to their countries. This reconciliation reflected a deeper transformation in understanding. Sakai and his fellow Japanese veterans came to recognize that their defeat had not been shameful or even avoidable under the circumstances. They had fought with courage and skill against an enemy whose material advantages were simply too great to overcome. The lesson was not about Japanese weakness, but about the limitations of military valor when confronting overwhelming industrial disparity. In modern warfare, the nation that could build more ships, more planes, more tanks, and train more soldiers would ultimately prevail regardless of individual heroism. The statistics of American industrial production during World War II remain staggering even decades later. The United States built over 297,000 aircraft during the war, compared to Japan's 76,000. American shipyards launched over 5,000 major combatants versus Japan's 630. American factories produced over 88,000 tanks, while Japanese industry built approximately 6,000. Artillery pieces, trucks, small arms, ammunition, and every other category of military equipment showed similar disparities. More remarkably, America accomplished this while simultaneously improving civilian living standards, a feat that seemed impossible to those who experienced total mobilization in Japan or Germany. American citizens during the war enjoyed better nutrition, higher wages, and more consumer goods than they had during the preceding decade of economic depression. This paradox of guns and butter, military mobilization combined with civilian prosperity, reflected an economy so large that it could do both simultaneously. Japanese military planners had understood before the war that America possessed superior industrial capacity. What they had not grasped was how completely that advantage would translate to military dominance once American industry fully mobilized. The attack on Pearl Harbor, intended to cripple American naval power and buy time for Japan to consolidate its conquests, instead unified American political will and triggered the full mobilization of American industry. Within months, the industrial giant that Japanese strategists had hoped to avoid awakening had roused itself and focused its productive capacity on winning the war. The ultimate weapon in America's arsenal was not the B-29 bomber, not the Essex-class aircraft carrier, not even the atomic bomb. It was the assembly line, the mass production techniques pioneered by American industry in the decades before the war, applied with systematic efficiency to military production. This manufacturing superiority meant that American forces could absorb defeats, learn from mistakes, and return with improved equipment and better trained personnel. Japanese forces, lacking equivalent industrial depth, could not replace losses and gradually weakened under sustained attrition. Saburo Sakai's observation over Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, that he had never seen so large a convoy before, contained within it the seed of understanding that would flower into full comprehension only years later. That convoy was not an exception or a desperate gamble. It was normal American operational capacity. Within weeks, similar or larger convoys would be assembled for other operations. The ships he saw that morning were a small fraction of the vessels American shipyards would launch during the war. The aircraft he fought against represented a tiny percentage of the planes American factories would build. In the decades after the war, historians and military analysts have examined the Pacific War from multiple perspectives. Some focus on individual battles and the tactical decisions that determined their outcomes. Others emphasize the roles of technology, intelligence, or strategy. But underlying all these factors was the fundamental reality that Sakai witnessed on that August morning. Industrial capacity had become the ultimate arbiter of modern warfare. Nations that could not match their enemy's production capability could not win wars of attrition, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. Japan's decision-makers, confronting this reality in the war's final months, faced an impossible choice. Surrender meant acknowledging defeat and accepting occupation by foreign powers. Continued resistance meant condemning millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers to death in a war that could not be won. The atomic bombings provided a face-saving pretext for choosing surrender, allowing Japan's leadership to frame the decision as response to an unprecedented weapon rather than admission that they had been systematically defeated by conventional industrial superiority. The legacy of this industrial disparity shaped the post-war world in ways that continue to resonate. American industrial dominance, demonstrated so conclusively during World War II, underpinned American global power throughout the Cold War and beyond. The lesson that industrial capacity determines military capability influenced defense planning for generations. Nations seeking to challenge American power recognized they needed not just military forces but industrial bases, capable of sustaining those forces in prolonged conflicts. For Japan, defeat led to reconstruction and transformation. With American assistance and guidance, Japan rebuilt its economy using modern manufacturing techniques and quality control processes. The same national characteristics that had made Japanese forces formidable warriors, discipline, attention to detail, organizational skill, were redirected toward peaceful economic competition. Within decades, Japan became an industrial powerhouse, demonstrating that the capacity for industrial excellence had always existed, but had been channeled toward military rather than civilian production during the war years. The American occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952 facilitated this economic transformation. American advisors helped restructure Japanese industry, introducing mass production techniques and quality control methods that had proven so effective during the war. Japanese engineers and managers studied American manufacturing processes, adapting them to Japanese conditions and culture. The Japanese education system was reformed to emphasize technical training and scientific education. Labor unions were legalized, improving worker conditions and productivity. Land reform broke up the concentrations of agricultural land ownership that had kept rural Japanese in poverty for generations. This reform created a prosperous class of small farmers who became consumers of manufactured goods, stimulating domestic market growth. Zaibatsu, the family-controlled industrial conglomerates that had dominated pre-war Japanese economy, were dissolved and reorganized into more competitive structures. These reforms, guided by American occupation authorities but implemented by Japanese officials, laid foundations for the economic miracle that would follow. By the 1960s, Japanese manufactured goods competed successfully in global markets. Electronics, automobiles, and machinery bearing Japanese brand names became synonymous with quality and reliability. The same attention to detail that had characterized Japanese military equipment production was applied to consumer goods with spectacular results. Sony, Honda, Toyota, and other Japanese companies became global leaders in their industries. Japan's economic growth rate exceeded that of virtually all other developed nations. This transformation demonstrated that industrial capacity depends less on natural resources or inherited advantages than on education, organization, and investment in productive infrastructure. Japan, lacking most raw materials required for industrial production, became one of the world's leading industrial economies by importing resources and adding value through sophisticated manufacturing. The same nation that had been unable to match American production during the war became a model of manufacturing excellence in peacetime. Saburo Sakai lived until September 22, 2000, surviving long enough to see Japan transform from defeated enemy to close American ally and economic partner. He died at age 84 after attending a formal dinner at Atsugi Naval Air Station, where he had been an honored guest. His life spanned the full arc of modern Japanese history, from pre-war imperialism through devastating defeat to post-war prosperity. His combat experiences, particularly that morning over Guadalcanal when he first comprehended the scale of American industrial capacity, provided him with insights that shaped his understanding of the war and its meaning. In his autobiography Samurai, co-written with Martin Kadin, Sakai reflected on the differences between Japanese and American approaches to warfare. He acknowledged that Japanese pilots possessed superior individual skill in the war's early months, but recognized that American emphasis on training large numbers of competent pilots ultimately proved more effective than Japanese focus on producing a small elite. He admitted that the Zero, for all its remarkable performance, represented a design philosophy that prioritized offense over survivability, a choice that made sense only when victory could be achieved quickly. Most fundamentally, Sakai came to understand that modern warfare rewards nations that can sustain production and replace losses. Japan's industrial capacity, though impressive by Asian standards, was dwarfed by American productive power. This disparity meant that even Japanese victories in individual battles contributed to ultimate defeat by imposing losses that Japan could not replace while America could. The convoy Sakai saw at Guadalcanal was simultaneously a display of strength and a preview of inevitable Japanese defeat, for it demonstrated that America could project overwhelming force across vast distances and sustain that projection indefinitely. The story of Saburo Sakai and countless other Japanese aviators who fought against American forces illustrates a profound truth about industrial warfare. Courage, skill, and determination matter in combat, but they cannot overcome fundamental resource disparities when those disparities are as vast as existed between Japan and America during World War II. The Zero was an excellent fighter aircraft. Japanese pilots were highly skilled. Japanese tactics were often superior. But none of these advantages could compensate for the simple fact that America could build 10 aircraft for every one Japan produced, train 10 pilots for every one Japan trained, and keep them all supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts while Japan struggled with increasing shortages. When Emperor Hirohito broadcast his surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, he spoke of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. For Japanese military personnel who understood what had happened, the unendurable truth was not merely that they had lost the war. It was that they had been defeated by an enemy whose industrial capacity made Japanese defeat inevitable from the moment American industry fully mobilized. All the courage, all the tactical skill, all the willingness to sacrifice had been insufficient because the fundamental equation of industrial production had never favored Japan. The mathematical reality was stark. America produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000. America built over 5,000 major combat vessels. Japan built 630. America manufactured over 88,000 tanks. Japan built approximately 6,000. In every category of military equipment, American industry outproduced Japanese industry by factors ranging from 5 to 1 to 15 to 1 or more. These production ratios translated directly to combat power ratios that Japanese forces could not overcome. More subtly but equally importantly, American industry improved its products continuously throughout the war while Japanese industry struggled to maintain production of existing designs. American fighters in 1945 were far superior to those flown in 1942. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair completely outclassed the Zero in every performance category except turning radius. American bombers became larger, faster, and more capable. American ships incorporated new technologies like radar and improved anti-aircraft systems. Japanese equipment, by contrast, stagnated as industry focused on producing sufficient quantities of existing designs. American research and development during the war produced innovations that widened technological gaps. Radar technology advanced from primitive early warning systems to sophisticated fire control radars. The proximity fuse represented only one of many innovations in weapons technology. Communications technology gave American forces advantages in coordination and command that Japanese forces could not replicate. Medical technology and logistics saved American lives in ways that Japanese military medicine could not match. American wounded received advanced medical care at aid stations, field hospitals, and rear-area medical facilities. Sulfur drugs and later penicillin prevented infections that would have proven fatal. The survival rate for wounded American servicemen exceeded that of any previous war. In late 1944, Sakai was ordered to join a kamikaze special attack unit. The desperation implicit in this order represented the final acknowledgement that conventional tactics could no longer inflict sufficient damage on American forces. The kamikaze campaign reflected strategic bankruptcy masked as spiritual resolve. In early 1945, the invasion fleet that assembled for Okinawa included over 1,500 ships. The Battle of Okinawa demonstrated the full application of industrial advantage. Offshore, kamikaze attacks struck with unprecedented intensity. Over 1,900 sorties damaged or sank dozens of ships. But even this maximum effort could not drive the American fleet away. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 brought continued resistance to an abrupt end. The Manhattan Project employed over 130,000 people and cost over $2 billion. America could afford to pursue advanced weapons development while simultaneously fighting a global war. Saburo Sakai's kamikaze mission, scheduled for August 16th, was cancelled when Japan surrendered. He survived to reflect on his experiences. In later years, he became an advocate for peace and reconciliation. He recognized that the defeat had not been primarily about courage, skill, or fighting spirit. It had been about industrial capacity. In 1991, Sakai attended a reunion in San Diego with American pilots he had fought against at Guadalcanal. Among them was James Sutherland, whose Wildcat had absorbed Sakai's cannon fire. The two men embraced as friends. Sakai apologized for shooting down American pilots. Sutherland responded that they had both been doing their duty. Post-war Japan rebuilt under American occupation, transforming from military empire to economic powerhouse. The same dedication that had made the Zero a magnificent fighter was redirected toward manufacturing consumer goods. Japanese industry became renowned worldwide for quality and efficiency. Saburo Sakai lived until September 22, 2000, reaching the age of 84. He spent his later years as an author and lecturer. He befriended former American adversaries, demonstrating that reconciliation was possible through mutual respect. Sakai emphasized that Japanese pilots had been superbly trained and had fought with extraordinary courage, but they had been sent to fight a war that industrial realities made unwinnable once America fully mobilized. Modern warfare had become primarily an industrial contest where the nation with superior production capacity would ultimately prevail. The lesson Sakai drew was that nations considering war must realistically assess their industrial capacity relative to potential enemies. Japan in 1941 had regional military advantages that might have been preserved through defensive strategies. But once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and triggered full American mobilization, the war's outcome became virtually certain. This understanding came too late for the millions who died in the Pacific War, but it informed post-war Japanese strategic thinking and contributed to Japan's decision to pursue prosperity through peaceful economic development rather than military expansion. When Saburo Sakai died on September 22, 2000 at age 84, he left behind a legacy that transcended his combat record. He had shown that former enemies could become friends. He had demonstrated that understanding defeat need not diminish pride in service. Most importantly, he had helped explain how industrial capacity became the ultimate arbiter of modern warfare. The convoy he saw at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, remained throughout his life the symbol of this transformation. Those ships represented industrial might that Japan could never match. The battle that followed showed American forces could absorb losses and return stronger, confirming that industrial superiority translates directly to military dominance in modern warfare.